Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Ross Whitaker, and in this podcast series I talk to filmmakers about their documentaries, both in terms of the subjects they choose and the way in which they fund, craft and distribute their work. In this episode I speak to John Dower about his new feature documentary, The Balloonists, which is releasing in selected cinemas from May 22nd in Ireland and the UK. The Balloonists is an awe-inspiring film that follows explorer Bertrand Piccard and British flying instructor Brian Jones as they take on the world's top aeronauts and billionaires in a high-stakes race to become the first to fly nonstop around the world in a hot air balloon. John Dower is one of my favourite filmmakers, a director who is equally capable of delivering on a thrilling plotline while having a special touch for bringing out the character of the people in his films. This combination is perfect for this story of daring do by a fascinating and eccentric cast of flight enthusiasts. Here's a clip from the trailer.
When I was 12 years old, I witnessed the liftoff of Apollo 11. I said to myself, I want this type of life. We decided to be the first to fly around the world non-stop in a balloon.
We were going to change everything. We only had 6 months to build this balloon.
A British and a Swiss balloonist have started the first non-stop balloon flight around the globe.
And the time came when we had to say goodbye to our wives, not knowing whether we would see them again.
When I waved him goodbye, that was the most scary moment, I think.
Sorry. We'd gone across the Sahara.
And we flew across China. That Richard Branson was a week in front.
The balloon has just 3 days worth of fuel left.
I was so scared.
And then ahead of us, huge storm clouds.
I don't know how we can avoid it.
If we went down, we would not survive. It was terrifying.
And then Richard ditched.
We start to believe it can happen.
We're up at 39,000 feet, trying to realize a dream.
John Dower, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for your wonderful film, The Balloonists, which is going to be available to viewers very soon. I really loved it. You know, it's such a beautiful documentary, and then so many fascinating characters, great twists and turns in the narrative. I suppose to start off with, John, for people who won't know the story, which I think is almost everyone, could you sum it up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much away. And I actually didn't know the story at all, which is, I always think, quite a good entry point for a documentary director with non-fiction. If you don't know it, then you've got more of a chance to take the viewer on, I mean, I hate that word journey, but it's very appropriate with this film. It gives you a chance to take the viewer on that same journey. It's, in essence, it's about the efforts to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. And when you say that, well, when I was told that story, everyone always thinks Richard Branson. And I actually, the part of me thought, well, didn't Richard Branson do that? If you watch our film, The Balloonist, turns out he didn't. And it was these two other guys that embarked on it. And a very unlikely pair, a Swiss adventurer explorer called Bertrand Piccard, who's got a very rich family backstory, and then this English bloke called Brian Jones, not he formerly of the Rolling Stones, but Brian Jones, who used to be in the RAF, was a keen balloonist, an engineer, and it's the story of these two guys trying to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. And that's it, in essence.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you know, the way that we won't get too far into the film and the twists and turns that occur, but towards the beginning of the film, give almost a brief history of flight and how much has happened actually in that world in such a short period of time. It must have been enjoyable to kind of look at that kind of material.
It was, because that brings with it some beautiful old archive, and it is, it slightly takes you aback realizing how much happened in terms of flight in quite a short space of time. From the Wright brothers to going to the moon in the Apollo missions. But this remained the one last challenge, going around the world in a hot air balloon. I mean, in some ways, I'm not surprised, because it's kind of a bonkers thing to do. I mean, when I was first approached by the producers, Teddy and Guy at Rise, when they first said balloons, I shamefully, the first thought that came into my head were those children's entertainers who make the animal shapes out of balloons, and it just felt like such an unlikely subject, ballooning. I also have a crippling vertigo, so I was immediately, my first thought was, well, I'm not going up in a balloon. And actually, shamefully, I never, in the whole course of the year of making this film, ever went up in a hot air balloon. When the one occasion arose, I in a moment of cowardice, pushed my DOP, my director of photography, into the basket. But it is kind of a nuts thing to do, because you are, as far as I'm concerned, you're in the sky in what is essentially a sort of, a glorified picnic basket, and you are completely at the mercy of the elements of nature. There's no engine, there's no motor. And the thing about ballooning, which I didn't really appreciate till I started making the film, is that it is literally traveling within and through wind. You need to find these currents of wind, and that's the only way you can do it. And if you see the film, you'll realize that one of the key characters is actually one of the people on the ground, this Belgian meteorologist called Luc Teulemans, and who's one of my favorite characters I've ever interviewed in a documentary. I mean, who'd have thought a Belgian weatherman could be so entertaining? But he's a crucial character on the ground. But yeah, you are completely unprotected. You are, you have to fly within clouds and thunderstorms and dodge them. I mean, it's genuinely bonkers thing to do. And I think that is what attracted me to the film, the sort of sheer eccentricity of it. I mean, I do think, not that I would ever compare myself to Wes Anderson, sadly, but I think if Wes Anderson ever made a documentary, this may be the kind of film he'd make, because there is a sort of collection of oddballs who are involved in this pursuit. And I say that in a very loving way, because I think they're great. I mean, they're slightly crazy, but they feel different to the sort of, the adrenaline striding supermen of mountaineering films. They are very much a different breed of adventurers.
John, I always find it so interesting. Like, one man's Everest is something that another person completely disinterested by. For Bertrand Piccard, who has the brilliant surname Piccard, which is absolutely fantastic, considering the Star Trek captain of the same name. But
well, no, that's no coincidence. The Star Trek captain is inspired by Bertrand's father, which again is not in the film. I'm going to do that thing. Not many filmmakers do this, but there is a bit of the film that we cut out that I, to this day, regret. And I find myself in these interviews and in Q&As going, why did we cut that out? So basically, Bertrand has such a rich family history. You know the Tintin books?
Yes, of course.
So the crazy Professor Calculus, is based on Bertrand's grandfather, who you see in our film in archive. I mean, there's some incredible old archive of Bertrand's grandfather flying up into the stratosphere in a balloon and a capsule. That was in the film, but for some reason we took it out. But yeah, there is. Bertrand is this, very slightly unlikely adventurer character, but he's got this wonderfully rich family history.
You know, you've directed series like the Lockerbie series, the Sophie Toscan de Plantier series that was on Netflix. This is a feature. When you talk about that and the material that you left behind, you know, how do you differentiate in your mind what makes it a feature versus a series? Because I felt watching it like, this is fantastic. I watched it with my wife last night, and my son got to watch the first half before he was sent to bed, very upset with us. But, you know, you're watching it and you're thinking like, you know, I feel like you made all the right decisions, but then I also felt like there's probably more here too, you know?
Yeah, if I'm really honest, Ross, and I should be, should I say this aloud? I'm probably talking myself out of future work. I mean, I often think many series should remain as features, as single films. Lockerbie, definitely not. There was so much story in Lockerbie, and also a lot of geopolitics. The film I'm currently doing at the moment on an alien autopsy was originally a feature for a long time, and at the last minute it became a series. I can't help feeling it still should have been a feature, but that's for others to decide when it comes out. This just felt like it fitted into a single film. And, you know, some of the decisions we made, and I should really give a big shout out to my editor in particular, David Charrop, who was instrumental in sort of forging the narrative that we came out with. We did lose we left a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor, but not the stuff that all the reviews point to. Everyone thinks, oh, they had a wealth of archive. We really didn't have a wealth of archive. And for the reason is that, you know, we're so used to the world we live in now where we film everything. But Bertrand and Brian, the only time they were filmed in the capsule is when they remembered to turn on these little GoPros, and often they just forgot. So we were very much at the mercy of when they remembered to turn them on. Thankfully, they turned them on enough times for us to make a feature. But, you know, there were other elements when we filmed this. We filmed a lot of actuality. There was a whole sequence which I loved, filmed at the balloon factory where the balloon was made, and in Bristol, and with the owner of the balloon factory, this very entertaining Scottish man called Don, who himself crossed the Atlantic in a balloon. We even interviewed some of the seamstresses who built the balloon, you know, who actually, knitted the thing together. But eventually, all that kind of material fell away, and persuaded by my editor, and, you know, this is a documentary podcast. Shout out should always be given to your editor, because they are the person that help you, you know, essentially tell the story in the cutting room, and they are so instrumental. But he and my producers as well were like, let's make this lean and as muscular as possible. Let's get into the balloon and its takeoff as soon as possible, and let's try and not leave the capsule at all. So, you know, we experimented at one point with a much longer, unwieldy narrative in which you sort of came out of the capsule, you saw the balloon, you had more backstory threaded through the actual event of them trying to circumnavigate the world. But we in the end, we binned all that off and went for this much more straightforward narrative. I kind of think it works. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting. I read a review the other day. I'm one of those sad directors that reads all the reviews and then churns on the negative ones. But hey, that's my problem. And there was one that sort of criticised it for being conventional and straightforward, and where's the poetry, and rather unfairly compared it to Werner Herzog's balloon film, which you're always going to be falling up short, I think. But that was a conscious decision. We could have had more of the sort of eccentricity of this world, but I'm not sure it would have lent itself to this slightly bigger, more propulsive narrative.
You do, in a feature film, you want to get the story up and running, and you want to see that balloon take off. I think around the time it took off, you know, I was dying for that to happen, so the timing felt good. I only watched it on a small screen at home, but I'd love to see it on a big screen, because there are lots of beautiful, kind of inspiring shots in there that hopefully people will enjoy. Let's talk a little bit more about Bertrand and Brian, and maybe each of them in terms of the characters that you found in the film and how you related to them, what you wanted to bring out from them.
Well, I'll start with Bertrand, because obviously Bertrand is in inverted commas, the hero of the film, because it's his idea, it's his project. And what I first loved about Bertrand when I first met him, I was, slightly, I mean, I'm always, even now, slightly intimidated when I meet some of the characters I film with. I mean, when I made Thriller in Manila all those years ago, a film we've spoken about before, my first meeting with Joe, I was terrified. I mean, not only because he's a former heavyweight champion of the world, but, he had that sort of awe and presence about him. And Bertrand had that as well. He's quite an intimidating figure in some ways, and that's a brief theme in the film about how he falls out with quite a lot of people he's trying to do this with. But what I loved about him, one of the first times I met him, is he just immediately started telling me about all the times he'd failed, and I that's obviously very interesting, because it's someone that shows you that kind of level of vulnerability so earlier in a relation. And as documentary filmmakers, we are making relationships, hopefully, with these people to tell their story and to honor their story. But he immediately shared these sort of moments of, I failed, I kept failing, and that sort of endeared me to him immediately. I thought, you know what, he's going to be a much more interesting interviewee than and I won't name them. I've named some. I've interviewed some sports stars in the past, not any that have featured in my films, but they have that inability to look round the sides of this successful persona they've created. And for me as a documentary subject, that makes them a lot less interesting. But Bertrand had that. Brian, what I loved about Brian is that he just, when I first went to see him, there was a sort of sense I'm not even sure I really want to do this, which again I loved. I mean, I had that with Bradley Wiggins when I met the British cyclist, when I first spoke to him about making a film. And Brian is incredibly unassuming. He completely nails the British stereotype of stiff upper lip. But you see in the film this sort of unlikely. They are. I mean, I liken it to a sort of strange buddy movie. It's like the Lethal Weapon of ballooning, but they are this unlikely pairing. And I think it's, they say in sports, stars make relationships and successful relationships. Well, that's definitely the case with these two. But essentially, look, at the end of the day, this is going to sound slightly banal, but for me, when I'm making a documentary, it all comes down to, at the end of the day, who is going to be telling the story in front of the camera? And it was clearly going to be Brian and Bertrand. And I just liked these two slightly different characters.
It's an interesting race, isn't it, where people are trying to achieve this thing, but they don't take off at the same time. No. And they're kind of at the mercy of, oh my God, someone else has taken off, we better get going here. Or, when one of them crashes, they're sort of semi-delighted while not really wanting to say it.
Yeah.
Bringing in other characters like Andy Elson, who was the pilot that Bertrand split from, and then guys like Richard Branson that had tried, I felt like that gave a lot of richness to this really difficult thing that they were attempting. Others were failing along the way, and in a way, it's kind of like not the central narrative, but that was obviously something you had to pick away at the same time. Yeah,
I mean, I do like. My style of filmmaking is I like an ensemble cast. I like a lot of voices. I think it brings a richness to a film. I mean, it's also really difficult to tell a story in a documentary with just one or two voices. I mean, they have to be really good and compelling, so you don't get bored of that voice, if anything. But I do, and I think other characters cast interesting light and shade and insight into your main characters. And Andy Elson I loved Andy. I mean, by his own admission, he's a very difficult character. He's a prickly guy. He falls out with people. He fell out with Bertrand, but he's got this sort of English eccentricity as well. I mean, there's so many bonkers stories about Andy that obviously we're never going to go into our film because they'd be in a film about Andy Elson. But he told us that he once took when he was like 13 or 14, he with a friend, he sailed across the channel in a dinghy, at age 13, 14, from the English coast to France in a small boat, and then rang his parents at the other end and said, "Oh, I need to get back. I don't think the dinghy's going to get me back. Can you send me some money for a train?" I mean, at that age, it's just, that is the mark of the man. And you see what happens in the film. There's this moment on one of the failed attempts where he has to, I mean, I still can't watch it without, my nether regions quivering, but, he has to come out of the balloon to fix a window. He comes out of the balloon capsule to fix a window with the one Allen key that they have on the vessel. This isn't putting together some piece of IKEA furniture. It's it's terrifying, but he's so matter of fact about it in the film. So yeah, he's obviously a great character, and the fact that he then goes on to be a rival. But you're right, this idea that they're in a race, but they all take off at the different time. I mean, I just find that so stressful.
Yeah, and I think that scene with Andy Elson trying to repair the outside of the capsule, it's really reminiscent of kind of those movies in space where like suddenly something's gone wrong and they have to go out in all their gear and float over, and it's absolutely gripping. One thing I love about your work, John, is the sense that you're in conversation with the people that you're interviewing and that you really seem to love the characters. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that? I mean, even with Luke, who's the weatherman / hero of the film, just those shots of the wind chimes and the exterior of his house, and sort of giving it a sense of this is the kind of place that a man like this lives, builds character into who he is very, very quickly. And I think, to me, it's something that you do so well. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I do. That is one of the ways I like to make my films. And again, I should put in a disclaimer, because I don't want to sound like some old, bitter documentary filmmaker, which I probably will end up sounding like this when I say it. But I do feel a bit sad these days that in a lot of documentaries, it feels like there's a conscious choice not to film people in their own home environments, and to film them in studios, or what to me often look like upscale rented Airbnbs that look sort of glossy but have no character. I like, I won't name the film, but a few years ago I made a film, and one of the commissioners was moaning, shitbagging me for your interview setups are not premium enough. You're just filming them in their houses and I'm like, but it's revealing of their character, and they can still look great and be beautifully lit. But I do like to film people, where they are, and I also feel like I don't think interviews in documentaries are valued as much anymore. I do feel often there is a sense that your characters in front of the camera are there to deliver plot, which can then be turned into reconstruction. And and you don't get a sense of people's backstories anymore. There's just not enough of that. And that's what I love. I love to know about people, and it's a cliche, what makes them tick. But that's one of the reasons I like my interviews to feel like a conversation. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't just turn up and shoot the breeze with them. I meticulously prepare for those interviews. I read everything I can about them. I sometimes try and have a conversation with them in advance, sometimes not. I'm also very careful not to, when I turn up at an interview, not to immediately start filming. And I often say, I've done a few sort of masterclasses and those kind of things. And I say to filmmakers, be brave enough when you turn brave. I mean, it sounds like a silly word to use when we're talking about two men that went around the world in a balloon. But you know what I mean? Have the courage of your convictions when you turn up to interview someone, to maybe keep the camera in the bag for the first half an hour. And yeah, you're going to be missing things, but I guarantee it, when you come to do the interview, you'll get more out of your interviewee because you've sat and talked to them like a human being without pointing something at them for the first, even the first 10 minutes, and I do write a lot of questions, but then I rewrite them and I rewrite them and I rewrite them. So they're almost in my head. But yeah, I do think if I've got one strength as a documentary filmmaker, and believe me, I've got a lot of failings, it is I really care about the interviews and getting that person to tell the best version of the story and to have unexpected moments with them. I think the building a relationship with your documentary subject these days is a tiny bit of a dying art, and I think that is a shame. And now people are just going to think, God, what a sad old bitter bastard.
But the reality is you can still deliver all the plot while revealing more character with their surroundings, with how they interact with you, on top of the transcript that you end up with that people seem to want to work from. And also sometimes you include your own voice. You probably prefer not to, but you're not afraid to do that, which again gives you a sense of there's a real person here interacting.
No, but that's a really good point, Ross. And I do like to include my own voice, and not because I'm a narcissist. Well, obviously I'm slightly a narcissist. All directors are slightly narcissistic. You have to be. But I do like, as you say, I like that sense that there is a human being behind the camera asking, this has come out of an interaction between two, living and breathing people. And I like it when there are moments where that lends itself to a bit of frisson. I like the sense that the viewer understands there is somebody making this. It's not just being made by an algorithm.
So when you have your interviews in the can, it sounds like you did plenty for this. What's your approach then with all that material? Do you get it transcribed? Do you watch it with your editor? What's your kind of approach to that next phase?
It's always been the same. And again, listen, I know we're on a documentary podcast, and I don't want to feel like I'm sort of handing down tablets of stone, because I'm winging this like everyone else. There is no playbook for being a documentary director. I mean, I'm not really sure there's a playbook for being a director. I mean, it's slightly worrying when I'm suddenly, I've got no next film to go to. It's like, well, I can't do anything else. I don't have any sort of tangible, transferable skills. And I didn't go to film school. I basically learned how to be a documentary, in inverted commas, by listening to DVD extra commentaries back in the day. But this is my method, and it sort of seems to have worked for me so far. But what I do is, once I've got the material, I go into the edit and I hand them over to the editor, and then I leave. I always want my editor to watch them without me. I never want to be there when they watch the first set of rushes, because I think there's a whole point of having an editor. Films can only be made by, the whole thing, it takes a village. Well, it does. And, I don't understand directors that edit their own material. Good luck to them, but I just don't get it. You need that other eye. And I don't want to be sitting on the shoulder of my editor, because it's different. When you do an interview, you, as a director, there are bits that you think, oh, that was really great. Oh, didn't I ask a bloody brilliant question there, didn't I? And those are the bits that you slightly fall in love with. Well, no, I want the cold, objective eye of someone sitting in a room that hasn't been on the shoot and was like, yeah, it wasn't that great a response. Or, I want to see what, they bring to those rushes first time round. I do get them transcribed now. I didn't used to, actually, but I do now, because I think, particularly when I do a series, there's such a volume of material. It's the only way to sort of keep across it all. But that is very simply what happens each time with my rushes. And then, I mean, don't get me wrong, then there will be a lot of back and forth between me and the editor, but that's how the process starts.
And do you tend to have like a very long cut that you work down from, or do you kind of watch the selects and go like, okay, this is the direction we're going?
I just start to put together an assembly, and yeah, it's usually quite long. I also like to film and cut. So I quite often I don't like to arrive in an edit with all my rushes. I like my existing rushes to dictate what else I might go and film. Partly I do that as a reasons of money, because I am very, I'm sure there are production managers out there screaming, disagreeing with this, mainly for the wine I like to sometimes buy on shoots. But I feel that's a bonus, because I do feel I save productions money, in that I do think that if you shoot some of your main material and hold back other things that you were thinking of shooting, it becomes quite clear that some of the stuff you were originally thinking of shooting, you don't actually need. So don't waste time and money going and shooting that. So I do like to shoot, cut, which is harder and harder to do these days. It's maybe a bit old school, but it sort of continues to work for me. And I'm very upfront with production companies beforehand. It's, on this 3-part series I've just done on an alien autopsy, it's like, I want to shoot a master interview. Not even I don't call them master interviews, because I like to go back and forth to my characters and shoot them, along the way. But the first interview with one of my characters, I want to shoot that now before we've gone into edit. Then we go into edit. And sometimes, quite rightly, production companies get nervous and like, we're only going into edit with a couple of interviews. And it's like, don't worry, we're just going to keep filming throughout.
It probably saves in the long run, if that helps you to
Definitely.
make decisions.
Definitely. I'd stand by that. I really do. And I would argue that pretty much all my productions come in on budget, sometimes under budget, usually on schedule.
It's a good ad there for John Dower.
not that you get not that you get any badges for that, but
yeah.
Hey, I do like to. Although this alien autopsy one has run on longer, but for many other reasons, which I won't bore people with here.
Well, John, listen, I'll let you get back to your sound mix, but before I go, just one last question, which I like to ask everyone. Is there any advice that you would give to a younger version of yourself that could be useful to, say, a young documentary maker listening to this?
Oh, blimey. That's a really good question. I think, I'm talking to a filmmaker at the moment, and she's about to make she's directing her first documentary. And it sounds so hokey, but, she's got so many execs telling her so many different things, and it's giving her the fear. And she says, I'm really worried. I said, well, first of all, don't be worried. Every film I do, and I've been doing this for over 25 years, I'm fucking terrified. I get the fear every single time. So that's natural. And try and cling on to the things that you wanted, why you wanted to make the film in the first place. When she first pitched the film to me in an edit suite, I'm like, that's brilliant. Stick by that. And people are trying to whittle that down. And it's hard. It's particularly hard at the moment in the current economic climate for making docs. But I think if you want to become a distinctive filmmaker, which why any of us are doing this, try and retain some of that distinctiveness. I think that would be, that was a long rambling answer. I'm not sure that was very precise advice, but that
well, I think it's, if a filmmaker doesn't have a voice, then I suppose what value are they bringing?
Yeah, and I feel that there's a trend now to sort of, to place less emphasis on the voice, but I'm trying to stick up for directors' voices here. And one final thing I'd like to say, which someone I haven't name checked, is the composer on the Balloonists, Nick Foster, who did such a wonderful score. If you're fortunate enough to, please, I beg people to try and go and see this in a cinema. It is going to have a limited cinema release at the end of the month. It plays so well on a cinema screen, not only because the epic nature of what they're doing and some of the archive, but the score by Nick Foster is wonderful. It's so good.
John, thanks a million for joining me. It was great chatting to you. And as I said to you before, I love your work. So I enjoyed this one immensely, and I look forward to the next ones.
A pleasure. And thank you, Ross, for fighting the good fight and promoting docs.
Thanks again to John for taking part in the interview. His film, The Balloonists, is in selected cinemas from May 22nd. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting this podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly sharing his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.